It's my pleasure to start the first panel, the Fiscal Health of the American City, and I'd like to introduce Christy McFarland, the Research Director for City Solutions and Applied Research at the National League of Cities, where her work includes two leading major annual projects, the City Fiscal Conditions and the State of Cities. Please join me in welcoming Christy McFarland to the stage. And I'm also proud to introduce Andrew Rashofsky. I can't help calling him Andy Rashofsky. He's a fellow at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and is a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where we were colleagues in the Public Policy School, and Andy was one of the greatly admired researchers and teachers at the La Follette School. Andy has published widely on public finance, and his current research focuses on property tax and the fiscal conditions of the nation's largest central cities. Please join me in welcoming Andy Rashofsky. So now I get to sit over here with the panelists, so I get a different perspective on you all. This is the panel that is going to be the baseline for everything. What is the fiscal state of American cities? Would you like to start? All
right. Well, I think each of us have a presentation, so I'll start that, and then we'll have a discussion. Looking forward to it. All right. Well, thank you, Graham. I'd also like to thank Catherine, Lusk, Executive Director of Initiative on Cities. You've both been incredible to work with leading up to the conference, and it's been exciting to learn more about what the initiative is doing, to see a lot of synergies, obviously, between the work at National League of Cities and the work that we're discussing here today. So it's typically the rare occasion that I'm in a room full of other people who are just as excited about city finance as I am, so I'm really happy to be here. And obviously, key to understanding how we create fiscally sustainable cities in the future is understanding the current context that cities are dealing with. Today, I will discuss the fiscal context in terms of the fiscal structure of cities, particularly the structure that are imposed on cities by their states, as well as the current fiscal conditions that are created largely as a result of these fiscal structures. And David, Boston, obviously everything that you were saying, for better or worse, is indicative of cities across the country dealing with both uncertainty at the federal and state level, as well as rising costs in terms of pensions and healthcare and infrastructure needs. So it all resonates very, very loudly, and our goal here, obviously, over the next 2 days, really is to help bring some fresh perspective and answers to some of those key questions. Before I go too much further, I am very well aware that I'm in Massachusetts in the Northeast. When I say cities at National League of Cities, we do represent cities, towns, and municipalities. So if you are from a town or you work with towns or you're from not from a city per se, just close your ears or swap out town for city occasionally as I'm going through some of this. We do recognize the value of all of our local governments. As we mentioned, obviously, cities are creatures of their states. States, in this way, circumscribe the abilities of local governments, cities in particular, to raise revenue. We know in our new report that we developed just this year, we examine the fiscal relationship between cities and their states across the 50 states using data from Census of Governments, as well as direct engagement with our state municipal league partners. Generally, what we found is that cities across the board are experiencing greater limits on their revenue-raising capacity, despite the fact that we are still recovering, cities by and large are still recovering from the Great Recession. And no state has afforded its cities additional sources of revenue since the recession. I know some of you from Massachusetts are thinking, what about the local option meals and hotel tax? In the context of our study, we look at access to taxes that are generally applied. So that tax in particular acts more as a tourism tax. So we can talk about it later. It's still obviously important for the discussion. I'm looking forward to talking about that. So what does this relationship look like? And I will talk about this in terms of municipal taxing authority, reliance on own source revenues, state aid, as well as tax and expenditure limitations. So municipal fiscal authority, what access do cities have to sources of revenue for their general fund, including a property tax, sales tax, income tax? We know that no state gives all of its cities in the state access to all three of these taxes. Massachusetts cities, like many cities across the country, are very reliant on property taxes. But we also know that a mix of tax sources, both elastic sources like sales and income tax, as well as less elastic sources like property tax, are really critical in order for cities to be able to buffer during economic downturns and also to reap the benefits during economic growth. So this is sort of one element of the city-state fiscal structure. Looking at own source revenue reliance, so what is the portion of general funds that cities have to fund services in their community that come from these major sources of taxes as well as fees and charges? We know that about 70% of cities' general fund comes from these sources. And an increasing portion over the past 30 years that we've seen, an increasing reliance on fees and charges. This is a trend that is generally probably not sustainable going forward, particularly because of the regressive nature of fees and charges. A poorer family is paying, generally speaking, the same amount for a service, and that makes the fees more regressive for those residents. But with limitations from the state level, with political challenges of raising taxes, cities really aren't left with many options. We know in Massachusetts, for example, though, that there's also a rise in property taxes, and I believe that the property tax is at the highest rate now that it's been in the past 33 years. The next element of the city-state fiscal structure relationship is state aid. Again, we know that well-structured state aid really should serve to increase the overall capacity of cities, particularly to equalize the fiscal base of cities that have less capacity. On average, cities receive about 17% of revenues from the state. Massachusetts, like a lot of other states in the Northeast, or cities in Massachusetts, like many others in the Northeast, have a much higher percentage of aid from the state, largely because education is included in that equation. But we know that states are balancing budgets too. And this means that it's often at the expense of cities, unfortunately. And Massachusetts highlights this in some strong ways. You really can see the uncertainty that stems from a heavy reliance on state aid. Although the current governor's budget really proposes an increase in unrestricted local government aid, we're seeing mandates for special education that are underfunded and school transportation reimbursements that are at reduced levels. So it really comes with uncertainty when there tends to be over-reliance on state aid. Looking to tax and expenditure limitations, so essentially these are voter or state-imposed limitations on tax and expenditures. At the local level, tells come primarily in the form of impacting property taxes. So caps on the property tax rate, limiting the growth in assessments, or limiting the total revenue growth from property taxes from one year to the next. 41 states across the country impose some type of tell on their cities. Interestingly, though, many states in the Northeast who only have access to the property tax, generally speaking, have less of tax and expenditure limitations, which create an environment where, at least in sort of the broad comparative across the country, sets cities up in the Northeast comparatively well because they have less restrictions on their source of revenue. So within these constraints, how are cities faring? We annually conduct our city fiscal condition survey. It's a survey of city finance officers. David, I hope you hope you complete your survey. I know Boston is an active participant in that survey. We collect budget information, we gauge policy actions, and we also examine the informed opinion of finance officers. It's the only source of annual finance data for the municipal sector. The federal government cut funding for this type of data collection back in the 80s, and NLC picked up the ball. There's also revenue sources. There's also sources of information available through the census, but that's updated only every 5 years. So this year's survey, not unexpected, is that the worst is behind them when it comes to city finances, but they have not yet returned to full recovery following the Great Recession. So we look at a few key indicators of how our city's faring. And the first is the outlook of city finance officers. So we asked city finance officers, is your city's budget better able or less able to meet the fiscal needs of your community this year over last? And interestingly, 80% of finance officers reported that their city's fiscal health is better able to accommodate the needs of their community this year over last year. This is great news, obviously. It's the highest percentage that we've seen in the history of the survey. But on the flip side, it's also very indicative of the nature of the recession. It's indicative of the magnitude of the recession, the depth of the recession, the number of cities that were actually that were struck really hard by the recession. Looking to general fund revenues as another indicator of fiscal condition. As we've discussed, cities' general fund revenues provide funding for general city operations comprised of taxes, fees for services, development, and some mix of intergovernmental aid. And I think when we look at the general fund revenues, it really paints a picture of a tempered optimism on the part of city finance officers. We know that general fund revenues grew by almost 3% in 2013 compared to 2012. It's the first post-recession year-over-year growth in revenues. But the bad news, as we see here, revenues stand at about 90% of 2006 levels, which was the height pre-recession, and are projected to stagnate as cities close the books on 2014. Massachusetts city revenues are actually faring a little bit better at, the revenue growth is at 4%, whereas nationally it's 3%. But if we look a little bit closer at the drivers of the general fund, property sales and income taxes. This graph shows the constant dollar change in property income and sales tax from one year to the next. Basically, it's answering the question, what is the percent growth or decline in the various sources? The blue line is property tax, gray line is income, and red line is sales tax. Typically, sales and income taxes respond more quickly to economic conditions. They're more elastic, whereas property taxes, the bulk of revenues for the majority of cities, lag economic conditions and take longer to recover. This is why a mix of tax sources really is ideal for cities. But as we know, that is often not the case. During the recent recession, all three tax sources declined together due to the severity and the length of the recession, which is a unique circumstance that we've found throughout the history of the survey. We know that property taxes are anticipated to increase slightly as collections catch up with improvements in the real estate market. And this will be the first increase coming out of the recession. Sales and income taxes continue to grow but are projected to slow. Then this really is indicative of the type of employment recovery that we're seeing, that it really is dominated by low wage recovery. Another indicator that we gauge through our city fiscal condition survey is ending balances. Why are ending balances important? They provide a cushion for cities during difficult economic times. They are also an indicator. They're also an indicator for bond underwriters looking at cities. Say, how likely is the city to make good on its debt? And having solid ending balances is one way that they gauge that. So we measure ending balances as a percentage of general fund expenditures. The good news, ending balances are on a positive trajectory at 22% of expenditures coming out of 2013. Prior to the recession, ending balances were around 25%, so we still have a little bit of ways to go, but we are on a positive trajectory. thinking about the factors that are influencing budgets, I think we're all well aware of these. On the negative factors, we have rising infrastructure costs, health benefits, pensions. These are no surprise, and these are the same factors that are driving budgets in Massachusetts as well. In terms of the most positive factors that are influencing cities, the general overall economy, local economy in particular, is helping to create a more stable tax base, but again, cities have limited access to tap into some of that growth. So I think that will be something worth discussing a little bit later on. And just a quick review. As we know, many local governments, unlike our friends and colleagues in the federal government, are required to balance their budgets on an annual basis. That's critically important because, as we've heard already today, cities aren't just waiting until the end of the fiscal year to say, hey, you know, what are we looking at in terms of our revenue and what expenditures do we have? It's a consistent assessment of the revenues and expenditures that are facing the city. They make adjustments throughout the year in order to accommodate that, and that's particularly important given levels of uncertainty that are coming from state and federal government with regards to aid that's coming to the city as well as their capacity to increase revenues. So within the constraints of the fiscal structure, we've already talked about cities are turning to user fees for services, to a lesser degree property tax rate increases to the extent that they can. On the expenditure side, we're seeing that cities report they're reinvesting in public safety, which is a great thing. Reinvesting in capital infrastructure projects, although I think not necessarily to the levels that are needed following a lot of the deferred maintenance that was caused by the recession, and also increasing and re-examining employee wages. So the bottom line, cities were at the forefront of the Great Recession, and they're making their way back slowly. They're making the tough choices. They're innovating where they need to. They're engaging in partnerships, but given the persistent constraints on city budgets, cities need more than the creative workarounds that they've been doing. They need a consistent toolbox of revenue options that align with the underlying economic drivers in their changing economies. They need to be more adaptable. They need to be able to help meet the needs of their residents, who are the same residents that state and the federal government are also trying to serve. And they need a set of revenue options that allows them to innovate in the ways that we've now come as a country to expect of them. So with that, I'll close, and I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christy. And now Andy, who's done a lot of very thorough and careful work in this area, will give his perspective.
Thanks, Graham, very much for that nice introduction. I'm really delighted to be here this morning and looking forward very much to the next 2 days. This is a session on the fiscal health of cities, and there are many ways in which one could think about city fiscal health. And in recent years, I think a lot of the focus has been on city insolvency and bankruptcy. But bankruptcy, insolvency is a very rare phenomena in the United States and in most countries, and I suspect that it will remain a rare phenomenon. That does not mean that city fiscal health of all cities is in fine shape. There are a number of cities that I would argue are in weak fiscal health, poor fiscal health, but are of no danger of going insolvent. So we need a new definition, and I want to focus on what I'll call structural fiscal health. Here, what do I mean by structural fiscal health? I think I want to start with the proposition that the quality of life of city residents really depends upon the flow of goods and services. Good, high-quality public services is critical for the economic growth of cities and the welfare of its residents. So we need a measure of fiscal health that really focuses on individuals And we might think of city fiscal health, and a city is in good fiscal health if it has sufficient revenues to provide the services for which it is responsible. And so what that means is that assessing the fiscal health of cities, we really need to focus on service delivery to residents and businesses of the city, of any city. Oops. I think everybody in this room has a sense of the factors that contribute to fiscal health and to weak fiscal health. Obviously, the city's economic base is important. Weak economic growth reduces fiscal health. We look at the growth of jobs. If a city loses population and employment, that's a big, serious issue. If there's deterioration in housing prices, declining infrastructure. Secondly, what's the contribution of higher levels of government? If there's limited help from the state and federal government, that makes city fiscal conditions worse. And now turning to the expenditure side, if cities that have particularly high expenditure needs tend to be in worse fiscal health. And there are several factors involved. Some states provide a wide range of services, state governments, while others require that their local governments provide most services, where states do relatively little. So the breadth of service responsibilities on cities is a really important determinant. Secondly, who are the citizens that are being served at the city? If there are a concentration of poor individuals, and particularly a concentration of what I might call dependent individuals, that increases city expenditures, reduces revenue-raising capacity. It's really striking to look at Detroit, where close to 60% of the population might be called dependent. They're either the young, the old, or working age but disabled. These are individuals who require services but don't contribute much to the fiscal capacity of cities. What I want to do is, and a little different than Christy, is focus on the nation's largest central cities this morning and provide you with some data. The problem with whatever data you use, either a survey or, as the Pew Trust does, they examine for 30 large cities CAFRs, or census data as I use, it's hard to compare cities because of a vast difference in governmental structure that we observe in the United States. And I think we can explain that. I can explain that by one picture. So let's look at the green line. Those are city revenues in 2012. Boston compared with Columbus, Ohio. Boston's revenues per capita are almost three times higher than in Columbus, Ohio. So it seems like Boston's a big spending, big revenue city. But we all know in this room, I suspect, that Boston doesn't have an overlying county that does lots of services. It's a dependent school district. They provide their own education. If we go to Columbus, Ohio, counties spend lots of money and raise lots of revenue, and an independent school district also, or school districts provide a revenue. And if we add up those sources, the revenues and on the spending side, the spending that goes to city residents and businesses from these overlying governments, what do we discover? That in fact these two cities have revenues that are on a per capita basis exactly identical. And so that observation led myself and some colleagues to develop what we called fiscally structured standardized cities, or FISCs. And I'm going to give you some numbers today that will look at FISCs. The issue of defining FISCs is doing this adding up across a range of cities, 112 of the nation's largest cities, and we have data which are all publicly available since 1977, and it allows comparable data. In the minutes that remain, I want to do three things, I guess. One, talk about the impact of the Great Recession on the fiscal health and fiscal condition of cities using these FISC data, to talk a little bit about the prospects going forward for city fiscal health, and finally just conclude with a few observations about policies that city leaders might pursue to improve their fiscal health given the fiscal environment in which they operate. This is a graph of average for these 112 cities since 1977 on per capita spending and revenue adjusted by the CPI. So probably a conservative price adjustment. And I want to focus on, the trend is obviously up, but I want to focus on the two periods when revenues went down. First, the recessions, the double recessions in the 1980s, and what we see here, that is, it took 6 years for both revenue and spending to come back to their pre-recession levels. And it's also interesting that that dip that you see in revenues and expenditures in that green circle is due entirely to very high inflation rates during that period, double-digit inflation rates. Actually, nominal revenues and spending actually grew through this whole period. Now, let's contrast that to the Great Recession. One, the reductions are larger. Absolute terms, percentage terms, since 2007 to 2012, over 7% reduction in revenues. And we know from what Christy told us and some other data that these go up, these are census data to 2012, but data for 2013 and 14 suggests that, yes, the decline has probably bottomed out, but there hasn't been much increase. So it's anybody's guess how long it's going to take for revenues and spending of our cities to get back to their pre-recession levels. And it's likely to be well more than a decade. In the next couple slides, I just want to explore a little bit what's behind what kind of revenues and what kind of spending are declining. These are graphs since 2006. The top one, you can see the taxes went down by 7.1%, property taxes by even larger percent, and state aid declined from its peak by almost 10%. These are large reductions. The only source of revenue increase were in the area of user charges, which actually went up. And important to emphasize that what I'm giving you, I don't have time to give you data on individual cities, but there's a lot of variability. If we looked at Miami, for instance, the drop is about 18% in general revenue, mainly due to property tax. All sources of local and state revenue declined, and federal revenue. And we look at Springfield, Massachusetts. There we actually see about a 12% revenue increase. Springfield is heavily reliant on intergovernmental aid, state aid, and federal aid, which both grew during that period. Here, the spending side, and these look like they're increases, but they're all declines. And I'll just, two quick comments. One, every function that cities, on average, pursued, spending is reduced. Even social services. And with the Great Recession, there was a great increase in demand for social services, but we spent 4% less money. And then point out to the right-hand column, and that's capital outlays. And capital outlays declined by the most, by 18%, just in a period when interest rates were very low. And if I have time, I'll come back to that. Let me talk a little bit about the prospects, fiscal prospects going forward. First, locally raised revenue. What are the options that cities have? What are the possibilities of cities have to raise their own revenues? And obviously, the answer is going to differ by cities. Cities in weak economies are going to have less options. The mix of taxes is important, as Christy mentioned. Again, cities don't have much control over that, but they can push for a broad variety of tax sources. A well-functioning property tax system, and by that I mean a system where assessments are done accurately, there's transparency, and collections are taken seriously, good efficiency, and use of fee, creative use of fees and charges, and we'll come back and talk about that some more, I'm sure, but some cities rely on fees and charges by a great deal, and some, and too much, the Ferguson, Missouri example, and other cities not enough. And as Christy mentions, the presence of state-imposed limits really are of concern, and they have been growing, particularly property tax limits in Wisconsin, in New York, states imposing new and stricter limits on property tax levies. And that clearly is a concern if one wants to increase property tax revenues. What about influence of state and federal policy? And state and federal policy obviously influences cities in many, many ways. I don't have time to talk about them, and I'll just focus on state aid and federal aid. In the research that we've done, we've seen that, and here I'm talking about the FISCs, the largest cities, that over the course of the recession, the cuts in city state aid were about proportional to the cuts in tax revenue for the states in which the cities were located. Now, it's important to mention that there are some exceptions. Some states, and Rhode Island is a good example, were the state aid cuts, so affected Providence, were much larger than the state tax revenue reductions. So there's a lot of variability there. What can we say about the future? Obviously, state aids is going to depend about how states do in terms of their revenue production. And I think there are some worrying black clouds out there on the horizon. We've seen a number of states have cut income taxes, some without alternative sources of revenue, and Kansas is obviously the poster child for that. We've seen a number of states with either have done or are proposing a shift from income taxes, reduction in income taxing, moving to sales taxes. That's, I think, very worrisome for cities because, as Christy mentioned, income taxes tend to be elastic. They grow with the size of the economy. The sales tax in the United States is as some people have said, last century's tax. We tend not to tax services. We tend not to, at the moment, tax internet sales. A larger proportion of consumption is in those areas. It's not growing nearly as fast. If the growth rate of state revenue declines, as current trends suggest it might, that is very bad for the prospects for continued state aid, and particularly in the education area for states. What about federal aid? And as you probably know, almost all, both direct and indirect federal aid to city comes from the budget category called non-defense discretionary spending. And here's a picture, courtesy from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, of that category, non-defense discretionary spending, as a proportion of GDP. And that blue line is the average since 1975. So you can see the stimulus that we had at the beginning of the Obama administration, and then the decline. The bottom line there is current law, and the blue and the red are the Senate and the House budget bills for fiscal 16 budget. There's a conference committee that's going on. I just read yesterday that they're close to coming to an agreement. So almost certainly what comes out of the conference committee is going to be somewhere between that blue and red line. That's heading down. So that means that, and we don't yet know how much specific programs that benefit cities are going to go down, but if the total pot is decreasing in such a dramatic way, that's not good news. Let me just conclude with a few observations about policies that could be pursued by city leaders. And the whole agenda of this conference is really focusing on those issues of policies. And so I'm just going to sort of summarize or highlight a few things that I think are particularly important. One, thinking about increased revenue-raising possibilities. Are they new sources? There was already a discussion, President Brown, about pilots. And so an area that needs to be considered. Second area are adopting cost-cutting and service-enhancing policies. For many years when I was at Wisconsin in a graduate program in public policy, we had a workshop each year where we worked with the budget office in the city of Milwaukee. And they would come up with issues that they wanted the students to look at, and the students would come up with recommendations. And both Mayor Norquist and Mayor Barrett over the years accepted a lot of those proposals. They tended to be what you might call small bore, something to operate in the fire department a little more efficiently, or what kind of gasoline to use in the garbage trucks, something about street lighting policy. Small things that either increased efficiency or reduced cost, but they do add up. And a well-functioning city that has its house in order needs to continually search for new ways to operate more effectively and efficiently. I also, and I realize the politics are really bad when you start talking about metropolitan area and metropolitan cooperation, but so many of the city's problems and issues are encompassed in a metropolitan area. And there's a lot of research that suggests that a strong, fiscally strong central city is good for the whole region, the whole metropolitan region. And so the key is for city leaders to try to convince suburbanites and suburban political leaders that it's in their own self-interest to cooperate with the cities, to help the cities, or to exploit economies of scales where they exist. Cities are often well-run. They have scale economies that allow them to use efficiency, use e-government much more efficiently. They can sell services to municipal governments and suburban governments in, I think, a quite potentially profitable way. And final comment is just about the fact that there are low interest rates now, and it really is important, in my view, for cities to invest in maintenance and in capital infrastructure, because if they don't, the well-being of city residents in the future is going to be reduced, and the prospects for city growth, I think, will be greatly diminished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. There is a weather forecast that is issued in England, where I grew up, which puzzles a lot of visiting Americans, and that forecast is sunny intervals. And Americans say to me, does that mean it's going to be cloudy or sunny? And a little bit of both. And I listened to the presentations this morning and thought, sunny intervals. There were, on the one hand, things seem to have bottomed out, but we don't know how quickly things will improve. There are, Andy said, very clear clouds on the horizon in terms of constraints on federal and state willingness to support cities. And we've also have this question of the increased reliance on user fees, which sometimes seems to me, sometimes I hear economists say user fees are wonderful, that the people who are paying for using a service are paying for it. I tend to think of user fees as a way of avoiding the tough choices and saying, well, you know, we're not raising your taxes, but we're raising your user fees. Overall, perhaps we can just return to this bottom line question. How worried are you about the fiscal health of cities? You sounded quite encouraged, Christy.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, and what we've seen is that cities are remarkably resilient. As Andy mentioned, there are only those few cases where we're seeing municipal bankruptcy, and in those circumstances, it's something unique to the management of that city, or a bad investment, or it's generally not a circumstance that's indicative of cities either nationwide or even within that state. So generally speaking, cities, like they have always done, will do what they need to do to balance their budgets, and that may mean a leaner city. But I think the question is not about what types of choices do cities need to make to maintain the stability of the current residents and the current city, but it's really about what do we want our cities to be in the future? What expectations do we have of our cities to create innovations to deal with the most pressing problems that are facing the country today? I think all of us would recognize that cities are gaining a platform and a spotlight like they never have before because the buck stops at the city. There's no place else to turn, and cities are taking on that challenge. But what's fair? How are cities going to pay for that going forward? They're going to be innovative in the ways that they need to be, but I think we really need to rethink the toolbox that cities have available to do that in a more sustainable way and in a more widespread way, not just innovations maybe in a particular area of service or a particularly innovative city. There are often times that we come back to the same cities because they seem to be innovating in multiple different ways, but how can we create that in a more widespread, sustainable way going forward?
And Andy, you raised very capably this question that the benefits of cities and the problems that they're confronted with are not commensurate with their legal boundaries. I've had the pleasure of meeting with a number of mayors over the last year and heard about issues both in the United States and overseas that have ended up on the plate of cities because nobody else can deal with them. I, for example, met with the mayor of Rome, and he talked about the tremendous costs for Rome in dealing with housing, feeding, clothing migrants who've we've been hearing about the tragedies in the Mediterranean have arrived in Rome, and it's certainly his job to deal with that issue. But from what I'm hearing you saying, Andy, your forecast is that the willingness of other layers of government to help cities meet new challenges or current opportunities is going to diminish.
I think, first on your observation, I think the needs and the pressures on cities are only going to grow, and cities are and have been the service providers of last resort. And so particularly worrisome is when the federal government is reducing, at least in relative terms, not only direct spending for cities, but support of some programs that help provide a social floor, or social safety net for individuals. And many of these individuals live in our central cities. So I tend to be, in general, personally an optimist, but I'm finding it harder and harder to be optimistic about the long-run prospects, at least of some cities. And I think it's very important to emphasize that while we can talk about averages, there's lots of variability. And there's some American cities that are in very deep fiscal stress. Their current ability and their future ability to provide services is much diminished. Boston will and some other cities are doing quite well, and they tend to be cities that are global cities and international cities, and that's a great advantage that, frankly, most of the cities in the central cities in the United States don't have those advantages and are likely never to have them.
Well, I'm sorry, Christy.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add that I think it's really important to think about the relationship of cities with their states and the federal government, not only in terms of aid that's coming to the city, but also the tools that those levels of government provide to cities, or the lack thereof. So we talked a little bit about decreasing aid, and of course that's concerning to the long-term sustainability of city finances. But if that's declining, we should be giving our cities greater local control to access the economic growth and the changes, or at least adapt to the economic changes that are occurring locally. We know, for example, that many states had gubernatorial elections. Many of those campaign promises were around tax reform, and what does that mean? That means in a lot of instances, local property tax reform. We're seeing in Texas, for example, that traditionally had a large share of local control, had minimal state aid. That was sort of a compact between the cities and state. You know, we won't ask for too much state aid, but please maintain our local control. We're seeing that threatened, and we're seeing that across the country. That tool that cities have to access revenues to support the residents and to continue services is being threatened. At the federal level, yes, of course, we're seeing community development block grant funding decrease. We're seeing other sources of aid from the federal government decrease. But now what's also on the chopping block, talking about tax reform, we're seeing the tax exemption for municipal bonds is being threatened. That's a huge source of investment, critical source for cities to continue infrastructure investments going forward. Besides the fact that transportation funding bill, we're still not sure where that's headed. Online sales tax, ability to collect those taxes, we're seeing some progress, but still that's uncertain going forward. So not only are we seeing declines in aid from those levels of government, but we're also seeing restrictions in those general tools that cities should have available to them to continue to provide the services and to continue to innovate in ways that we expect them to.
We have a wonderful variety of backgrounds, experience in this room, and we've got plenty of time for discussion and questions. So who would like to make a comment or ask a question? And I think that we probably need a microphone for the speakers. Is that right? Or not? For people asking questions. Here we go. Mayor Williams. Oh, and can people just introduce themselves because not everybody will recognize who everybody is.
Yeah, Tony Williams. I'm CEO of the Federal City Council in Washington, D.C. Great presentations. All the discussion and literature about pension overhang in cities, and not a lot of discussion by the two of you. Is this overstated, or where would you place this in the context of your presentations? The liability, long-term liability of cities for pensions and other benefits.
It turns out I had a couple slides about exactly that question of the pensions, which I cut out just because of time. And so let me just spend a moment saying, with some colleagues at the Lincoln Institute and using data from the Boston College Retirement Center on pensions, we have put together pension information for the largest 112 cities for the fiscs. So it's not only city pensions, but it's the overlying school districts and so forth. And I don't have the initial numbers at my fingertips, but the basic story is that there are a few cities and I measured two things. One, unfunded pension liabilities per capita, and look at across the range of cities. So there are a few cities, Chicago is clearly there, where those numbers are very high. But for most of the biggest American cities, the numbers are probably manageable, sort of $4,000, $5,000, some of them considerably less. Now, is that a big number or a small number? Hard to say. If we look at the annual required contribution, which, as you know, is the combination of what you have to pay each year to maintain pensions or to fund pensions for current workers, plus the unfunded part, the amortized value of the unfunded part, and we measure those relative to the general revenue of cities, they tend to be in the range of 5%, 4%, 5%, a few outliers where it's really concerned. Now, is having to pay 4 or 5% of your revenues going each year towards fulfilling your pension liabilities, is that a large number? It obviously doesn't go towards providing current police service and education and so forth, but I don't think it's the kind of disaster that sometimes gets painted in the media.
Now, don't reassure people too much, because we've got a whole panel on pension reform coming up. So keep them worried a little bit, Andy. I'm sorry, I have some trouble seeing through the lines, but there was a question over here, I think.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, hi. My name is Jonathan Rodriguez. I'm an organizer of the Boston Teachers Union. My question was, I saw it was very worrisome across the country, trying to raise revenue off the backs of low and middle income Americans, right, off user fees and kind of these regressive measures. I was wondering, in your experience, are there any cities trying to raise revenue, cities and states, because I think we should think of them in conjunction because of so much of a lot of cities rely on the state government aid, that are doing revenue in a progressive way, that are raising revenue in a progressive way. I can't think of one, but maybe I'm trying to find some silver linings out there.
Christy, do you want to do
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, right? Because that's why we're here. I mean, we've heard, about social impact bonds, tapping other sectors to help, increase investments in social services, for example. In some instances, we're seeing, ballot measures, and in some cases, that's touted as a way to say, hey, the voters are saying they want to have a new revenue source for a particular project. But I think we need to think about these in the broader terms, thinking about recurring revenues for general services. I think a lot of what we often hear as sort of innovations, quote unquote, in revenue streams really are not as sustainable. They're either short term or they're for a very specific use. We're talking about some structural issues affecting city finances, and that really requires that we think at a more macro level about what are the capacities that we're allowing our local governments to tap into. So I think we do need to think a bit more broadly than that, and not only on the revenue side, but also on the expenditure side. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this going forward. But how are cities using, data, for example, in new ways that allows them to save costs and provide services in a more streamlined way? So it's always going to be a two-part equation. And again, cities are looking at that on an ongoing basis. It's not just about how do we raise more revenues, but what is the combined elements between revenues and expenditures that allows them to have a balanced budget and also accelerate the growth of the community at the end of the year.
Okay.
Oh, can I?
Sorry, Andrew, yes.
Respond. I think it's easy to say increasing user fees is regressive, hurts the poor, and I think that's a simplification. There are user fees that are probably progressive in nature. A number of years ago, Milwaukee did a fire user fee, which was proportional, and that the fee structure was proportional to the diameter of your water pipe. And that not only was a way of raising more money from institutions, nonprofits particularly, big hospitals, and for heavy users. So there are interesting ideas. You have to be clever in making user fees, and some of the things, you do user fees for tennis courts and so forth, can be progressive. That's point number one. Second point is we tend often to say, the property tax, cities rely on the property tax, that's a highly regressive tax. That's a debatable issue among economists, but one way that cities and states can make property tax more, maybe not progressive, but more acceptable and less burdensome on low-income individuals are expansion of things called circuit breakers or homestead exemption, things that give big credits or exemptions to relatively low-income taxpayers. So they are tools out there, and I just read in the newspaper yesterday there was an article about Finland, and where traffic fines were prorated as a proportion of your income. And the story was about someone who got a speeding ticket and had a 50,000 euro fine. He was a millionaire. I'm not necessarily suggesting that, but there are a lot of interesting ideas out there, both in the United States and around the world, that we might consider to make tax systems more progressive.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the University of Toronto in Canada. Thank you very much for your presentations. I really enjoyed both of them. You both mentioned the need for cities to have a mix of taxes because some taxes grow more with the economy than others, like income taxes grow more closely with the economy than, say, property taxes. It gives municipalities the flexibility to respond to local conditions. There are a whole lot of reasons. I write about this all the time, so I'm always happy when other people are saying we need a mix of taxes. In the Canadian context, of course, cities across the country only have access to the property tax, some other minor taxes, but no income and sales tax. So we often say that they need a mix of taxes. But here's my question. If cities that don't currently have an income or sales tax are given the ability to levy it, how keen will they be to do it? In our context, cities say they want access to other taxes, but what they really mean is the federal, and in our case, provincial governments should raise their income taxes and give them the money for them to spend. That's not what I consider a local tax or local flexibility. That's just another type of grant. So how keen would cities be if they were given access to a broader mix of taxes?
I mean, I think that's a great question, because we say more local control is better, and when we say that at National League of Cities, we say more options for local governments are better, and they have the ability to weigh the cost and benefit, particularly the administrative cost of collecting a tax. So I think that's a really worthwhile point. Well, we know, for example, in Massachusetts, right, there was the recent hotel and meals tax. I think since 2010, nearly 200 cities have instituted the meals tax, and 200 cities or so have instituted the hotel tax. So I think when we're looking at difficult times, that cost-benefit analysis will likely go in the favor of being able to raise revenues. But again, it's going to be a calculus depending on how much they anticipate being able to accrue from those different sources versus the administrative cost of actually implementing it.
I will just add, Enid, that I don't really have an answer for you, and it would be nice if we were able to actually observe and see what cities do, and expansion of, for instance, the sales tax, which might make a lot of sense for a number of cities, but for other cities, there's real danger that it would just move commerce to the suburban ring and would be self-defeating. So I think hard to have a general answer to that. Any new taxes in the United States these days seem to be a hard sell.
Yes.
Sorry. I gotta go.
I'm sorry, can you just wait 1 second while we get you a...
Thank you. Hi, Ruth Ann Fuller. I'm an alderman in the city of Newton. We've got a different tax problem just beginning to emerge, which is in our neck of the woods, cities and towns beginning to give property tax breaks to corporations in order to have them stay or move to a city or town. And it's beginning to escalate and beginning to cause problems. How do you view that in the context of what you're talking about?
My view is that property tax breaks, reducing the size of the tax base is really bad public policy, and it's hard for political leaders to fight back against threats that are often made, or implicit threats that if I don't get a special break, I'm going to leave. One response is obviously, if I give you a special break, what about all the other long-standing businesses in our community? Should I, it's not fair to them if we give targeted property tax relief. And if we exempt all businesses, the ability to then, we have to raise taxes on residents, and that will also reduce the competitive position of a place like Newton or any community. So it sometimes takes, I think, political backbone, but it's really important to try, as with all taxes, to have as broad a base as you can and not to give exemptions, to get rid of existing exemptions rather than expand them.
I sort of almost relate to the city leaders on this as the department chair. It's where you get a faculty member who gets a wonderful offer. It's very hard not to fight back and say, here's some extra money, or here's a little less teaching, please stay. And I'm just sort of putting myself in the position of a mayor who's expected to sit back and watch a major employer leave town or something like that. I think it's really, really tough position to be in. Thank you.
Morning. Hi, I'm Kim Driscoll. I'm the mayor in Salem, Massachusetts. And for those of us who are real budget geeks, this has been great. So thank you. It's been a terrific panel. Question for you, and it certainly builds off some of the other questions that we heard this morning. I'm curious how we juxtapose the need to be efficient and to have cost cutting and to really shed some of our institutionalized bad habits that I think every city has, regardless of how much we're working on data and really trying to build a more efficient operation, with the need to raise additional revenues from residents. And that's really where the dollars end up coming. Full disclosure, yes, we need strong state and federal partners. Clearly, we're not going to have safe neighborhoods and high quality schools and great quality of life without stronger investments, but it seems really hard for us to rely on that. I think we'd all agree on that. So that means we're going back to our own residents, who those of us at the local level we know, we see every day, we're not as removed. And I feel like many of my residents want to make those investments, but also have concerns that we're not as efficient as we can be. And some of that goes back to bad habits, sins of the past that still exist. And untangling those can be hard. And I'm curious if there are examples of places that have done it well, or how you juxtapose the need for more revenues from your own residents who want those same investments, but worry that the dollars aren't going to be spent wisely, or we're not operating as efficiently as we can.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think particularly for city leadership, there's a whole new set of skills that really are required to lead during these times of fiscal uncertainty. So I appreciate you making that point. I think obviously communication with residents is key, and it sounds like you're doing that and speaking to them in terms that are not fiscal terms necessarily, but terms that they can really comprehend around types of services and the quality and level of services that they expect. I would say, you know, one option may be to reinstill confidence. I know some communities have looked at setting aside a portion of the budget that they allow residents very specifically to be able to plan either community projects that are either specific to the neighborhood or community-wide. I wouldn't say this is a cure-all, because they tend to be a very small portion of the budget, but it's putting some of that decision-making authority directly in the hands of residents, so they can understand the types of revenue and expenditure choices that I think the city leaders need to make on a regular basis. And then when the city follows through with the project that the community planned, it again, I think it's just that extra vote of confidence that, okay, they're listening to us. I can trust them. And again, that it's not a cure-all, but I think it's one way that that cities can start that conversation in a constructive way.
Just one quick addition. I think cities often don't communicate enough with their residents. They get the property tax bill a couple times a year, and maybe there's a little note in there, but having communication that maybe special mailings that highlight, we saved so much on this, we've changed the way we're doing this service or that service. These are small things, but often I think they resonate with individuals, and they say, oh yes, the city is doing a good job, and they're more likely then to be acceptable of revenue increases.
Can I just follow on from that question and put you both on the spot? One of the things that in your presentations you emphasized was the variation in the condition of cities. And Andy, at one point you suggested it was the global cities like Boston that are sitting relatively pretty. But obviously a lot of people are going to be thinking, well, it's not just about that, it's about how well or badly cities have been led. How do you both see the determinants of this variation? What explains the success of some cities and the difficulties of others? Do you think it's questions of leadership or geography or what?
I guess I would start by answering, yes, leadership is important, but there are many American cities that, and Detroit is only one of many examples, and the Detroit bankruptcy was due, I would argue, to a perfect storm of a lot of different things happening. But there are a whole range of, let's say, 10 or 15 other American cities which have lost population, more than 50%, lost their employment base, are now have concentrations of high need citizens. I don't think any political leader could have stopped those. These are the decline in manufacturing in the United States. Those are trends that are much beyond the ability of any leader to do much about. And it's on the margin. Can you make things better? Can you reverse things? Those are hard things to do.
I mean, I think that's an important point. I think there are going to be those extreme cases, right, where even leadership is going to be a hard sell to fix a lot of those problems. But I think when we're talking about the cities, generally speaking, even those that are facing fiscal hardship, leadership matters a lot. And I will just entice you all to stay till the very end of the program tomorrow, Tuesday. We'll have a panel discussion with a couple of mayors right here in Massachusetts who've really taken that opportunity to use the leadership that they were entrusted with to help turn their cities around, primarily through fiscally. So again, if leadership matters, I think leadership today has a new set of skills that are required. And there are mayors and there are other city leaders out there who are making the tough choices and are turning their communities around.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Karen. I'll give you another chance.
Hi, my name is Grania Bell, and I've recently come from Ireland, local government sector there. And just a few comments first before I ask the panel a question. In Ireland, I suppose most of you know, it was dubbed the Celtic Tiger, and there was meteoric rise, very, very quick economic improvements in Ireland. And from a local government point of view, there was huge resources pumped into the system without really thinking too much on what we were going to do with that, just reactionary to the demands that were there. More deeply felt then was the economic downturn, and I mean, that's putting it mildly. It was a drastic change, and the local government system was in a complete state of flux. And I suppose my point is, economic trends, you've economic growth and you've economic downturns, that's the pattern. What is being done in Massachusetts to try and create a sense of urgency and collaboratively cities working together to see, okay, how can we sustain ourselves and bolster ourselves insofar as possible from those economic instabilities that are out there?
I think that's a really good point. I again, thinking about the relationship between cities and the state, we know that the state is increasing unrestricted revenues to the cities. We don't expect this to continue forever. But it really gets back to how can cities are the closest to their local economies, they're closest to the needs that their residents have. Can we improve the access that cities have to their revenue sources, to the tools that they have to raise revenues on their own? And in most cases, that's going to be the best way to help cities buffer. Again, looking at reserves and ending balances, we know that from a very practical standpoint, cities really are looking to build up their ending balances again. That gives them a cushion in economic downturn. We saw cities drawing from their reserves during the most recent recession. Reserves are on their way back up. They haven't reached full levels yet. These are some of the basic tools that cities have right now, and I'm excited really to hear from the discussions over the course of the next few days to see if there are some new ideas that are out there that are not only provide sort of a point in time access to revenue, but like you mentioned, provide that stability that cities need over the long term. Regionally.
Looking at service level agreements, things like that. Sorry, it wasn't so much looking at cities, looking individually.
There certainly are cities and regions across the country that are doing that. Obviously, politics plays a huge part, particularly in the Northeast. I probably will leave it at that, but there may be others from the Northeast, from Massachusetts in particular, that have a little bit more to say on the regional collaboration that is or is not.
Andy, 60 seconds, because people need their coffee, I think.
Right. Yeah, there are a few American examples, Minneapolis tax-based sharing and other collaborative approaches, but they tend to be relatively rare.
Even less than 60 seconds. Thank you both for such a wonderful presentation.